Welcome everyone. My name is Bill Morganti. I'm your moderator for today. Welcome to the May webinar put on by SWS using sediment enhancement to build tidal marsh resiliency on Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. I'd like to introduce our presenter here. Matt Whitbeck is a supervisory wildlife biologist at the Chesapeake Marshlands National Wildlife Refuge complex in Maryland. Matt has over 19 years experience working in tidal marshes and natural resource management issues on national wildlife refuges. Matt has a Master of Science in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences from Texas A&M University. On a more personal note, I met Matt a few years ago when another project he was working on, called the Glen Martin National Wildlife Refuge, came before the Wetlands Regulatory Agency that I work for. That site, Glen Martin National Wildlife Refuge, is actually now one of our 10 published wetlands of distinction. I have to put in a plug for Wetlands of Distinction, www.wetlandsofdistinction.org. So during actually a field trip that Matt had invited me and a few other people to Glen Martin is when Matt and I first discussed Blackwater, the Blackwater project that you'll hear about today from Matt. At that time, I was really impressed with the work that he was doing. I thought this was really a cutting-edge approach to mitigate sea level rise and marsh subsidence. And I look forward to Matt telling us about Blackwater. Maybe I'll just say really quickly, the presentation should last around 45 minutes, then we'd allow at least 15 minutes for questions afterwards, which you can all type your questions in. So Matt, take it away.
All right, thanks, Bill. I appreciate that, and I really appreciate the invitation to come speak about this project. We were excited about this sediment enhancement project, and we think that this type of work has potential to help out, not only Blackwater, but a lot of tidal marshes that are threatened by sea level rise, at least in specific circumstances. So let me take control of these slides here. All right, good. Okay, so first a little bit of background. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is part of a group of refuges on the Maryland's eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. We're just south of Cambridge, Maryland, and as the crow flies, we're about 60 miles southeast of Washington, D.C. There we go. Okay, so Blackwater is one of the oldest refuges in the Atlantic Flyway. It was established in 1933. Most of the refuge is acquired as migratory bird habitat and/or habitat for threatened and endangered species, species like the Delmarva Peninsula fox squirrel, bald eagle, peregrine falcon, and thankfully most of those species have been recovered and removed from the endangered species list. The refuge is now over 29,000 acres, and very roughly speaking, the refuge is approximately 1/3 open water, 1/3 tidal marsh habitat, and 1/3 forested habitat. And I should say that the marshes of the Blackwater River are typically brackish and microtidal, but of course that takes place along a gradient. So as you get towards the upper reaches of the Blackwater River, farther away from the Chesapeake Bay, you get more and more microtidal to the point where it's essentially non-tidal. The salinity decreases to its essentially fresh water, and then as you get down the river system towards the Chesapeake Bay, it becomes more tidal and higher in salinity. But overall, it can be characterized as brackish, oligohaline to mesohaline, and microtidal. So the Chesapeake Bay, of course, is the largest estuary in the United States, and Blackwater is a significant part of a large complex of estuarine wetlands within the Chesapeake Bay. So this map, the red on this map, is essentially the National Wetland Inventory of estuarine wetlands in the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake. And you can see that black circle, which is kind of the area of Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and adjacent Fishing Bay Wildlife Management Area. And you can really see how this project area is kind of the heart of the the largest expanse of estuarine wetlands within the largest estuary in the United States. But unfortunately, Blackwater is probably best known as a hotspot for marsh loss. So you can see this series of photographs here. You have 1938 on the left-hand side of the screen. This is an aerial image from 1938. You can see the well-defined river channel of the Blackwater River and the Little Blackwater River. You can see the vast expanse of tidal marsh stretching out around it. And then in the middle image, 1974, you can still make out those river channels, but you can see just that massive deterioration of wetlands. And then when you go to the right-hand image, 1989, you can see the river channels are essentially disappeared. It's converting essentially to a large lake-like feature where there once was a river and tidal marsh. And every time I show these images, I tell myself I really need to update this image series with something from, 2013 or at least this decade. And one of these days I'll do that, but I can tell you it hasn't gotten any better. Essentially, all those little fragments of marsh islands have disappeared. And we did a little GIS exercise with Salisbury University here in Maryland a few years ago, and they mapped the extent of wetland in 1938 imagery and mapped the extent of wetland in 2006 imagery and compared the two. And between those two time frames, approximately 5,000 acres of tidal wetland converted to open water. So clear evidence of just massive marsh loss within this Blackwater River system. So there are many factors contributed to the loss of tidal wetlands here. Many factors contributed to that 5,000 acres of wetland loss. And some of the biggest are sea level rise and subsidence. We have a very high rate of sea level rise and subsidence here in the mid-Atlantic and within the Chesapeake Bay. Saltwater intrusion. Because of man-made ditches and canals, we do get salt water that moves into the historically freshwater upper reaches of the Blackwater River, and that salt in that historically freshwater system has caused some unraveling of vegetation in that area. We have a severely modified river hydrology. We have a number of roads that bisect our Blackwater River system and interrupt the natural tidal regime that would have taken place in these marshes. And another big one is the excessive herbivory by non-native species, and this is primarily Nutria. And I'll talk about that again in a second. And the last one is erosion. And so historically, erosion probably wasn't that big of a deal within the Blackwater River system. If you think about that 1938 image, we had a series of small tidal ponds and a well-defined river channel broken up by lots of marsh. So erosion probably wasn't that big of a deal back in the day. But as that marsh broke apart and we get larger and larger water features, you get increased, fetch and increased wave action. And so these days, erosion is a significant problem, particularly on that marsh edge. So it's important to keep in mind that, it's important to keep in mind the impact that Nutria had on these marshes. These days when we're talking about marsh loss at Blackwater, we talk a lot about, sea level rise and subsidence, and undoubtedly that's a huge issue. But it's important that we don't lose sight that, Nutria had a significant role in the deterioration of that marsh system. So in 1998, it was estimated there were 50,000 Nutria just on Blackwater Refuge alone. And of course, this is a non-native herbivore that was introduced from the temperate regions of South America, brought to Blackwater Refuge in Dorchester County as another species that would kind of help out with the trapping and the fur trade that was so important back in the 40s. And of course, the populations did great. They exploded and they essentially devoured vast expanses of marsh. So because of the seriousness of this problem, we formed a broad partnership and gained support from Congress to eradicate Nutria from not only the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, but also the entire Delmarva Peninsula. And it's been an amazing success. So we can think about, 50,000 Nutria just on Blackwater Refuge alone. The eradication campaign started in the early 2000s with that funding from Congress. We brought on Wildlife Services with USDA to essentially run the eradication campaign. And we're celebrating 2 years without a single known Nutria population on the entire Delmarva. And that's just a remarkable success story. To go from 50,000 just on Blackwater alone in 1998 to not having a nutria anywhere on the Delmarva in 2017 is just an incredible feat. So what they're doing now is they're going through essentially this intensive surveillance program where they're going from watershed to watershed and just this saturation monitoring to try to find those last nutria. And the plan is once they saturate each one of those watersheds 3 times with 0 detections, they're going to call the species eradicated. Of course, it's extremely difficult to prove something does not exist, right? So that's the standard that we've set for the Nutria program is 3 rounds of saturation monitoring with 0 detections, and we'll call it eradicated. So, I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about sea level rise and subsidence, but it's really important to acknowledge, the work that's been done by that Nutria program, and it's really set the stage for everything that we're now doing. I mean, the idea of treating these marshes to build resiliency would really be all for naught if you just had these nutria there to devour it. So this Nutria eradication is really that critical foundation for everything that we're now doing. So with nutria no longer exerting this pressure on our wetlands, we can really focus on the challenge of sea level rise. And we're extremely fortunate here at Blackwater to have strong partners with a lot of researchers who've spent an incredible amount of time and energy to really get at the challenges of sea level rise here on Blackwater. We've had a number of folks from USGS and Virginia Institute of Marine Science, College of William and Mary, and University of Maryland, University of Delaware. Lots of folks that have really come down here and put a lot of time into studying the impacts of sea level rise and really provide the refuge with a lot of information on the factors that are driving these changes that we're seeing on the landscape. And a couple of key points that have come out of this research, and first and foremost, the remaining marsh on Blackwater, the elevation of that marsh platform is relatively low within our tide range. So we're really at the bottom end of the growth range for these tidal wetland plants. And so most of the marshes that we're talking about here are characterized by 3 square, the Schonoplectus americanus. I always want to say Scurfus, but Schonoplectus americanus, Spartina patens and Deciculus spagata, kind of your classic marshes for this area. And these plants, of course, are all physiologically adapted to the stresses of life in a tidal saline environment, but they can only take so much depth and duration of flooding before they essentially drown out and then break apart. And so much of the remaining marsh on Blackwater, the elevation of that marsh platform is relatively low within our tide cycle, so we're really towards the bottom end. So what that tells us is, future sea level rise and subsidence is going to continue to drive marsh loss on the refuge. Now, hopefully that rate of change will be significantly slower now that we've removed nutria, but moving forward, even without nutria, we can still expect a certain amount of marsh loss on the landscape. And the second really key finding is that, the marshes of Blackwater are developing vertically, and at a pretty good rate. But what we're measuring with, or what USGS is measuring with the SETs on Blackwater, that rate of elevation change really isn't sufficient to keep pace with the rates of sea level rise that we're seeing on some of our local tide gauges. So, we are accreting, but not at a rate sufficient to keep pace with sea level rise. So that just reinforces the idea that we're going to have to deal with future marsh loss here at the refuge. So we've looked at the aerial images, those historic images, and clearly documented the changes that we've seen in the past. We review the literature and look at all the science that's been done on Blackwater to kind of understand the factors that are driving some of those changes. And then we try to look to the future. We try to, we use some of these predictive models to understand, what's likely to happen as we move forward. And we're fortunate that the state of Maryland, the Maryland DNR, has really well-developed SLAM models for Maryland and in here at Dorchester County. And so what these models tell us, so the slide here is essentially our current condition. That kind of orange color is the emergent marsh. The what is that? Gray and green are our upland features, and of course the blue is open water. And if you put 3.4 feet of sea level rise on that, which depending on which predictions you follow could be around the end of the century, around 2100, you can really see just massive losses of the existing tidal marsh. Let me bump that slide back again. So there's the current condition. If you can follow this arrow, so here's the Blackwater River essentially moving down through the heart of the refuge, through Fishing Bay to Fishing Bay and the Chesapeake Bay. So that's the current condition again, and then the future. And because of our tidal regime, all of that area indicated as tidal flat is essentially open water as well. So some of the higher parts of the county hang on, but much of the existing marsh disappears, and much of the low-lying upland areas are converting to tidal marsh. So how to, as refuge, managers and refuge biologists, how do we develop an effective management plan to deal with this? I mean, to be perfectly frank, it's overwhelming. I've been here about 8 years, and those first few years were rough. You're looking at the forecast, you're looking at the rates of marsh loss, and it's quite a challenge. And so we partnered with the Conservation Fund in Audubon, Maryland, DC, and they really helped us come up with a strategy for an efficient and effective response to this challenge of sea level rise. And with this project resulted in our sea level rise adaptation plan, and that was completed in about, I guess, 2012 or 2013. And that sea level rise adaptation plan came up with a number of strategies for us to really think about on the refuge to really respond to the challenge of sea level rise. And the most important of these strategies is the idea of these marsh migration corridors. So, using those SLAM models, as well as, areas that we expect significant human population growth, areas that have significant barriers to marsh migration, we kind of put all those things together in one big model and identified where the largest expanses of tidal wetland are likely to be created in 2050 and 2100 through this upslope migration of tidal marshes. So as land subsides and sea level rises, the same process that's causing existing tidal marsh to convert to open water is also driving this upslope migration of wetlands into low-lying adjacent uplands. And so we're using these SLAM models and looking at population growth to really try to identify where the largest expanses of tidal wetland are likely to be in the future. And we're using these forecasts to essentially rethink our land protection plan and our land management strategies to ensure these corridors are on the landscape and these marshes can migrate upslope, and they're not going to be met by levees and bulkheads and that type of stuff. So that, to be honest, is one of the most significant changes that we've done here at Blackwater in response to sea level rise. And I should say that that GIS exercise we did with Salisbury University a few years ago, that the one that produced that number 5,000 acres of marsh that converted to open water. Another interesting finding of that report is during that same time frame between 1938 and 2006, almost 3,000 acres of upland converted to wetland. So during that time period, we had 5,000 acres of tidal marsh convert to open water, but also almost 3,000 acres of upland convert to tidal marsh. So that's the process that I think we have to work with to ensure that there's marsh here on the refuge into the future. And so on parts of the refuge, and I think historically, this is what this marsh migration zone looks like. You can see, as those forests get saltier and the hydro periods get longer and longer, those trees eventually die off. And then you have your high marsh species, your Spartinopatens, your Disticula spigata, essentially moving into those adjacent uplands. And I love this photograph because you can see that ghost forest. You can see all those dead trees, and you just see this beautiful, lush, high marsh meadow just taking over underneath it. And I think, as I said, there are some parts of the refuge that look like this, and I think historically this is how that process evolved as water levels rose in the Chesapeake Bay over thousands of years. Unfortunately, this is what we're seeing in these marsh migration zones on much of the refuge now, with the invasive Phragmites here, as that forest canopy starts to die back. When salt moves into the forest, the hardwoods are the first ones to go, and then eventually the pines give out. And that's a perfect foothold for Phragmites to start to establish itself. And because of the relatively low salinities we have, really not only on Blackwater, but throughout this part of the Chesapeake Bay, salinity never really limits Phragmites once it comes into a fully tidal situation. So Phragmites establishes during that period of transition, but then really persists. And unfortunately, I've got a feeling that these Phragmites dominated marshes are really going to be the marshes of the future unless we figure out a productive way of dealing with that, at least here in this part of the Chesapeake. So while protecting these marsh migration zones and dealing with Phragmites is going to be really a critical issue for the refuge and throughout much of the Chesapeake Bay moving forward, there are opportunities to build resiliency in high priority existing tidal marshes. And that's primarily through this thin layering of sediment, this sediment enhancement type work. And this was one of the strategies that was identified in that sea level rise adaptation plan that I mentioned. And so when the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the NFWF, put out their Hurricane Sandy Coastal Resiliency Grant, the request for proposals, the Conservation Fund threw a proposal in there, which was thankfully funded. And so the conservation fund secured funding for us to do this a little thin layering project here on Blackwater. And so let me just step back a minute. And so the way that this marsh deteriorates with sea level rise and subsidence is essentially its internal fragmentation and breakup. So as the sea level rises and land subsides, this slide kind of shows marsh breakup in the early stages. You can see a little bit of internal ponding. You can see kind of some clumping of the marsh vegetation, and over time, excuse me for a second. There we go. So over time, you can see less and less vegetation. You can see more and more open water until eventually you get the formation of these small ponds. And then as this process continues, adjacent small ponds coalesce, and then you get these large, just these vast expanses of open water. And so that's really how these marshes unravel over time. Wow. Okay. All right. So the objective of this project is essentially to add sediment to the surface of the marsh. We know these marshes are low in elevation. We know they're below, they're really at the bottom of their growth ranges for these tidal marsh plants that we're depending on. So essentially this project excavates material from the channel of the Blackwater River, pumps it up onto the surface of the marsh and builds elevation. And this really does two things. At a very basic level, if you add 10 centimeters of elevation to a marsh surface, you buy yourself enough time to withstand, that amount of sea level rise. So at a very basic level, you have that linear relationship of adding elevation to withstand a fixed amount of sea level rise. So there's that. But what I think is far more interesting is that by moving the elevation of the marsh from an elevation that's you're at the bottom of the growth range to an elevation that's really at the top of the growth range, you're buying that raw elevation capital, but you're also increasing the vigor and the growing conditions for those tidal marsh plants. So these plants can increase the rate at which they build below ground biomass. And for the marshes in the Blackwater River, below ground biomass production is the main way in which these marshes have built elevation for nearly 1,000 years here on the Blackwater River. So as these marshes have built up elevation, it's primarily through that accumulation of roots and rhizomes and below ground biomass. And so this work is really largely based on research done by Matt Kirwan and Glenn Guntenspergen right here on Blackwater Refuge. They published a paper on this in Ecology back in 2012. And this is a graph and some photos I've pulled from their paper. So if you can see the mouse cursor here. So essentially this elevation, right about 30 centimeters NAVD88, this is the elevation that's ideal within our tide range for maximizing below ground biomass production for these marsh plants. And unfortunately, this gray bar shows what our current elevation is, from 10 to 15 centimeters NAVD88. So by building elevation, we will move the elevation of our marsh platform from this low level to this high level. So we're buying that raw marsh elevation capital, and we're also maximizing the ability of these marshes to build their own elevation in response to sea level rise, which in my mind is really the definition of resiliency. And so the area we selected for this project is right here where that red circle is, kind of the southeastern corner of the refuge. We selected this area for a number of reasons, and of course, first and foremost is because it was showing signs of fragmentation and breakup, but also because it's part of what we call this marsh conservation zone. And so our partners in Audubon have been doing bird surveys, throughout this area for many years, and have identified this stretch that runs from Blackwater down into Fishing Bay Wildlife Management Area, which really is kind of the stronghold for the most at-risk salt marsh obligate bird species. Species like salt marsh sparrow, and in our area, black rail. This is really kind of a stronghold for this meta population that exists in this area. And so the project site is not good habitat for those two species now, but could become good habitat with a little bit higher elevation. So we selected that area because it was part of this, within this marsh conservation zone. It's also very close to an abundant and replenishable source of material, and it also has high public visibility. It's on one of our main public roads for this area. It's adjacent to a boat ramp, so it's an area that we can put up signs and really kind of communicate what we're doing to the public. So this is a close-up of the project area inside this red circle. So this is aerial imagery from 1938. See if I can move this mouse. Yeah, so if y'all can follow the cursor here, you can kind of see a pre-existing historic tidal pond. You can see a creek system that ties back into the main Blackwater River. And then within our project area, you can see a little bit of fragmentation, but really not much. By the time you go to the 1964 imagery, you can see some breakup in the heart of that emergent marsh. And then by 2013, I know this is leaf off or dormant season imagery, so it's a little harder to see, but you can really see all of that ponding that's happened in there. I mean, the marsh is really starting to unravel. This is a vegetation map that was completed just last year before the material was added. Those little points are bird survey points, so ignore those. But you can see a lot of the marsh within the project area is the Schonoplectus americanus, the 3-square only bulrush, and then a fair amount of smooth cordgrass, or the Spartina alterniflora. And so this is what we did. Essentially, we dredged material from the bottom of the Blackwater River, right in those areas, essentially borrowing material for the inner meander bends, and then we added material to the project area right there. So we were pumping material really no more than about 1,200 feet from the excavation site to the sediment placement sites. So during project planning, we took a series of cores within the Blackwater River channel and also within adjacent tidal creeks to kind of get an understanding of what this material is going to look like and try to understand how it's going to behave if we pump it as a slurry onto the marsh surface. And so if you look at these corings, really it's sample cores about 5 through 15 are the ones that represent the area that we excavated material from. So it's only those cores labeled 5 through 15. And so what we found out was this material is primarily silt and clay. Sand content ranged from anywhere from 4 to 47%, which to be perfectly honest, was a bit of a surprise. We don't have a lot of sand in our system, and I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but there it is. And the other encouraging thing we saw was the specific gravity from these areas were relatively high, which gave us a lot of confidence that when this material came out in slurry, it would fall out from suspension fairly quickly. It wouldn't float and drift as that slurry dewatered, so it would kind of stay on site and wouldn't drift back into the Blackwater River, which was really important. And the other encouraging thing is when we took those cores, that the sediment was fairly uniform in distribution vertically, so there wasn't a lot of vertical stratification. So as we excavated material from these inner meander bends, we were getting essentially the same material from top to bottom, which really helped with the logistics as we implemented this project. So here's kind of a typical profile from the area that we excavated material from, and one of our main concerns was, how would this excavation impact the river? When we dig material out of the bottom of this river, are we going to be creating deep holes that may turn anoxic and affect fisheries in the future? How is all this going to play out? And so, fortunately, if you can see the cursor on the screen, this red dash line is essentially the pre-construction channel, the bathymetric channel. So you can see the lowest part is over here toward the outer meander, or the outer of the meander bend. In the inner part, where we were excavating material, we could essentially dig down almost 10 or 12 feet without going any lower than what is already the lowest part of the channel. So the bathymetric surveys indicated that we had more than twice the amount of material we needed. We could take, like I said, twice the material we needed without really going any deeper than the existing river channel, which was really great news. So when the actual implementation of the project started in mid-November of last year, so about November 15th of 2016, the first thing we did is we installed a temporary plug right here. That's where this kind of tributary to that tidal creek, we wanted to make sure that we plugged that off so the material we added essentially didn't go running right out that tidal creek. So we installed a mass of clean sand that was secured with a biodegradable core mat, a coconut fiber core mat, and that was essentially a temporary plug that would prevent that sediment from leaving the project site. So pumping started in mid-November and ran almost every day until mid-December. We pumped about 26,000 cubic yards of material and spread that out over about 40 acres. So in the upper left-hand photograph, you can see the tracked excavator moving the pipe around, and you can see those essentially these two horizontal pieces of wood. And essentially that's how we set our benchmarks to know when we hit our target elevations. When this material was first deposited, getting around on the site was tricky, to say the least. So we wanted to have these visual benchmarks we could put out there before the project started, and would really serve as a visual clue for when we hit our target elevation. So that's how we kept track of material as it was being placed. And in that bottom right-hand photograph, you can see how that material essentially came out in slurry, hit that marsh surface, and essentially, spread out and just kind of found its own level across that marsh, across that emergent marsh system. So these two photographs, essentially, it's immediately pre-construction, and then just a few weeks ago. So that top photograph was in October of 2016, about 2 or 3 weeks before the project started. And you can see that expanse of 3 square marsh. The material was added in November and December of 2016. And then the bottom photograph is essentially roughly that same area just a couple of weeks ago, May of 2017. And you can see how that 3 squares essentially shot through that material and reestablished itself. We added about anywhere from 8 to 12 centimeters of material on average. And so that 3 square essentially popped up right through there. And so the plan from here is to allow that natural revegetation, that passive revegetation to take place whenever possible. The 3 squares reestablishing itself, and we're going to give it a little time to see what germinates on this newly exposed mud. So we're going to let that passive revegetation really do its thing. And then where necessary, we have saved some funds to go back in there and actively revegetate if it's necessary. Some of those small ponded areas that we essentially filled with material to recreate the marsh surface, you have no vegetation to underneath it. It's essentially a small ponded area. So in some of those areas, if we don't get germination, we may have to go in and actively plant those areas. So we saved some funds for that type of follow-up action. And so the last thing I want to point out is that one thing that all the project partners were in agreement on from day one is that we wanted to have adequate monitoring of this project. Whether the project works or doesn't work, we want to make sure that we have monitoring in place so we can really evaluate it. When we started this project, it's just incredibly hard. There's really only a handful of similar projects to really talk to people and understand, what they did, what worked, what didn't work. So we want to make sure we're adequately documenting what we do and also monitoring so we can really evaluate the outcome. I have a feeling we're going to hear more and more about these thin layering type projects, and I feel like, resource managers and regulatory people and policy people, folks really want to know what the impacts of these thin layering projects are. So we didn't want to miss the opportunity to monitor and help make our own small contribution to that body of knowledge. So we partnered with USGS. Glenn Guntenspergen has installed SETs out there to help understand how this project affects marsh elevation over time. Audubon is doing bird surveys. We have vegetation plots. We're looking at below ground biomass and a number of factors. And Albert McCullough with Sustainable Sciences, he was kind of the engineer on the project, and he's looking at how the marsh material consolidates and how the material compresses into the subsurface. So there's really a whole suite of metrics that are being looked at. We just really feel that it would be a shame to miss the opportunity to make a contribution to the body of knowledge on these thin layering projects. So that's really all I had for this afternoon. But if you have any questions, I'd love to respond to them now. And if you think of a question down the road, please feel free to email me or call me. Here's my contact information. If the questions are specific to the engineering, I'll probably refer you to Albert McCullough with Sustainable Sciences, because he could respond to that better. But here is my contact information if anyone wants to touch base with me at a later date.
Thank you, Matt. Excellent information on this cutting-edge approach. We do have a few questions, and I encourage attendees as well. If you have any questions, I can see actually there are 25 attendees on here, although I have no idea where you're from. So if people are wondering about applicability to their neck of the woods or whatever your questions might be, please send them along. In the meantime, I'm going to kick off with a few questions we have here. Matt, one question I have actually is about the Phragmites eradication. Is that, are you doing anything active with that now? Is that a part of what the approach for dealing with this now?
Yeah, as far as the broader marsh migration, it's a challenge. I mean, frag is a tough species to kill. It's one of those things tenacity is the most important component of any program dealing with Phragmites. So one of the biggest shifts with our Phragmites management program that came out of that sea level rise adaptation plan is really shifting our focus from controlling the Phragmites where it's the largest and most established on the refuge, kind of shifting away from that to essentially preventing the establishment of Phragmites in these marsh migration zones. So if you have a big stand of Phragmites that's been there for many years, you have a well-established rhizome system, you have a well-established seed bank, and it's incredibly difficult to convert that back to a native-dominated marsh. Whereas working in this marsh migration zone, you have these recently established little populations that are kind of popping up and establishing themselves as the forest dies off. And we're having a lot more success essentially, hitting those little newly established populations. We can spray them with herbicide, they die, and they don't come back. So essentially preventing the establishment of Phragmites may be far more effective in the long haul and a much better, more efficient use of resources than trying to remove it where it exists and has existed for a long time. So that's a pretty significant shift in the way we manage frag on Blackwater. Okay. Yeah.
Another question here. What is the actual vertical accretion rate in Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge tidal marsh as evidenced by the SETs?
So it's about 6 millimeters a year. And there's some great information online. If you Google, let me think, Don Cahoon, I think, was the lead author on it. It was one of the Joint Fire Science projects. So if you just Google Cahoon Joint Fire Science Blackwater, you'll probably get to it. These reports are available online, and he really provides a lot of, the main report was looking at the influence of fire on marsh elevation, but it's got a lot of that basic information on there on the, shallow subsidence rates and marsh surface accretion rates.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
How did you decide to use thin layering as a treatment for this project? How did you decide this was a suitable strategy for this specific type of marsh?
Nice. That's a good question. I think this whole thin layering thing, it's kind of it's been around in various forms, but the idea of adding material to an existing marsh to build elevation is relatively novel. It's been tried in a handful of areas across the country recently, and I feel like it's kind of become the new thing and something that could potentially be misapplied. Yeah, I think you really have to understand what's going on with your particular marsh to really understand whether thin layering is the right treatment for the ills, if I can use kind of a medical thing. And so here at Blackwater, because of all that research we've had, we know, what the ideal growth range is for our marsh elevation. And we know what the existing one is. And so we really know what's limiting the future of the marsh here on Blackwater. So by bumping that elevation up, we were pretty confident that would essentially directly address the limiting factor for marsh sustainability. So really, we were able to do this project with confidence on Blackwater, really because of all the work that's been done on the refuge by Don Cahoon and Guntenspergen and Kirwan and all those guys really provided the information we needed to make that assessment.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the areas where you have done planting of plugs or whatever you're putting in, have you had herbivory problems? Do you actually do you take measures to prevent that?
So we haven't had to actually plant anything yet.
Okay.
Well, not on this project. We've done other restoration project in other areas, but for this thin layering project at Shorters, all of that vegetation that's come up since we placed the material in November, December, that's all passive revegetation. That's all essentially the underlying, the vegetation that got buried, essentially growing and punching through that 10 centimeters of material. So that's all essentially passive regeneration. We haven't done any planting of plugs yet. But looking at areas that we have planted, I mean, it really depends on the resident goose population, because that's the main challenge with plantings. And in some parts of the refuge, we have a challenge with that. But down there on Shorters Wharf, it probably won't be an issue. So if we do actually put plugs in the ground, we probably won't put up goose fencing or anything like that, at least initially, and see how it goes.
Okay, another question. How did you contain the material that was spread across the marsh?
Yeah, that was a big question for us when we were designing this, because putting in some kind of hard line containment is expensive and honestly would certainly increase the impact of the marsh as we moved equipment around and tried to place and maintain that containment. So we were really looking for ways to use that natural vegetation as kind of a natural filter and containment area. And so that's what we ended up doing. We put the plug in that tidal creek to essentially prevent the material from going right out through that tidal channel. And then we have this naturally occurring berm that's pretty much the entire perimeter of the Blackwater River. We have a Spartina sinusoides kind of high bank right along the river, so that kind of served as a natural containment levee. So really the main challenge was that kind of that western and northwestern, where you just have that vast expanse of 3 square. And so what we did was we essentially used all that standing vegetation as a natural filter. When we placed the material, because of that high specific gravity, it fell out pretty quickly, and then essentially was filtered out by those acres of 3 square as that water kind of ran through that marsh vegetation. And that seemed to work out really, really well. We didn't detect any water quality issues, downstream on the river. So we're pretty pleased with the success of that aspect of the project.
Great. So I have one more question here. So I just want to encourage any of the people who are still on to, if you have any questions, to put them in now. But so Matt, what actually happens to the river channel? The material is excavated from the river channel, how will that change the river dynamics or even the habitat value surrounding that?
Yeah. So, it's, we were happy with when we did the bathymetry surveys and kind of got a sense of what the channel morphology was pre-construction. We were really pleased to see that we kind of had these deep areas already in place. So we could essentially, excavate material in this stair step fashion from the inner meander going towards the outer meander, and we had plenty of material right there without digging those deep channels, which was great. So, we're not going to create these anoxic holes. But really the neat thing about this is Neil Ganju did a sediment study on the Blackwater River a few years ago. And he found just massive amounts of material essentially being exported, down the river. If you kind of think back to that big body of open water that was created in recent years, essentially all of that material is essentially floating around. And when you get these hard northwest winds, that material is exported at just an incredible rate. And so Albert McCullough with Sustainable Sciences, when he was designing this project, he looked at the export rates that Neil Ganju reported and kind of looked at the volume of material and essentially came up with this calculation that he estimates that within 2 or 3 years, because of the volume of material that's essentially coming out of the river system, within 2 or 3 years, the material that we removed will essentially be built back up along that meander bed. It'll essentially redeposit itself along those meanders. So, and we'll monitor that and see whether that actually happens. But we're fairly confident that river bathymetry will rebuild itself because of that sediment export.
Okay, I do have a few more questions here.
Oh, cool.
How long do you expect to monitor before you might continue?
I wish we could monitor forever, but it's we did get a grant. Well, no, that was we'll do what we can with the refuge resources. I mean, we do have strong partnerships. The USGS, should be able to monitor that for at least a few years. Audubon is committed to monitor for a few years, and we'll do what we can with existing staff. But it's all contingent on funding. So we'll do it as long as we can. But it's we have to have the staff and the resources to get it done.
Do you think you'd be adding sediment again in the future?
Well, we feel like we've got that specific project site where we want it to be. And depending on what the results of the monitoring are, I mean, I would love to be able to do a similar project in other parts of the refuge. And this, we really have literally thousands of acres in need of this sediment enhancement. So really, it's all going to be limited by the funding that's available and the opportunities to get the work done.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is all the questions I'm actually having a hard time reading these, but I believe that's all the questions that people have sent in. Let me just check once more. Yes. So given that, I will say, Matt, thank you very much for putting this together. Really well put together. Really appreciate you sharing the information with us. And thank you, all the attendees, for listening in. I hope this has been valuable. And with that, I guess we will close.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.